Hello and welcome to this video on invasive species. Invasive species, or as they are otherwise known, noxious weeds, non-native aliens, and a few more are all referring to the same thing. It is a plant species that has been introduced into your local country or region's environment and causes harm. Sometimes this harm is by outcompeting native species, other times it is by being noxious. Some species simply cause damage to the soil, water, or kill off animals. And no matter how you look at them, the result is an adverse effect. Do note that although we are talking about plants, and particularly shrubs, vines, and trees, the term invasive species applies to fungi, animals, and microbial organisms too, so although we are relatively specific in this video's context, it does have wide ramifications. Although the topic might seem somewhat random, we make this as there are some species that are promoted as good bonsai that are actually invasive species. For that reason, although grown as a contained specimen, an invasive species bonsai should be taken with even more care and with greater care of, and particularly caution of, than usual. Let's start with the name. We gave a range of names, and these are only a few, with there being the obvious non-English terms, but also a range of more local or colloquial terms in use as well. The problem with the easiest and most common invasive species is that it is subjective, or at least that is the ongoing debate around it. What is invasive, and how do we establish that one species is invasive where another is not? It is true that in some locations it might well be a dangerous organism or plant, and in others not at all. And that's the question, is it true of all locations, or do we just state that it is an invasive species in a limited area? Narrowly and very specifically geographically isolating the application of that term. Some argue, as Agent Smith did, that humans would meet the classification of an invasive species, but we are not so inclined to fall into that philosophical quagmire just yet. Instead, we'll focus on research which has gained traction and grown a lot in the last 30 or so years. This has mainly been focused on either ecology or environmental science. This begins with nomenclature, that is the terms that are in use, and two researchers named Carlotti and MacIsaac created a set of terms that are in use, and they seem to be the most common or at least widely accepted, and this works on a staged approach. It begins with stage 1 and goes through to stage 5, although there are some intermediary steps. The stage 0 is essentially the invasive species begins residing in a particular region. This is for all intents and purposes seen as its native habitat. As such, it's not actually an invasive species at this point. However, stage 1 is when it begins travelling, and this can be done a number of ways. For example, seeds get mixed into seeds being transported to another country. A particular species might be taken to another country in order to have it used as a foodstuff, whether that's plant or animal. But this takes us to stage 2, the introduction of said invasive species. Stage 3 is when it localizes and it becomes, at least somewhat present. Not particularly large in scale, but present. Stage 4A is when it starts spreading out geographically, but the concentration isn't particularly high. Stage 4B is when it becomes dominant in small areas, but they are localized regions, so you may have it over a very large area, but in most places it's still not the dominant species. Stage 5 is when it's widespread and dominant. In some ways, this particular approach is better as it helps to decide on the danger presented and the appropriate degree of response. Further, it works on mostly a local level and not a whole nation or species level. This means that if, say, you're a government agency looking at this, you're no longer stuck thinking, oh great, we have a particular species and it's a, say, threat in one particular state or region, but it's not anywhere else. Well, it might be present there, but it's not causing any harm. You can really say, okay, in this area here, it is an invasive species that needs to be dealt with. This brings us to what you're actually looking at. What makes the introduced species dangerous? And it is that they can survive with relatively few members of the species present. Think of Matt Damon and his isolated Martian potato farm. Damn it, we fell into the trap of humanity again. However, we should say, this is not so far from the truth. It really only takes a few potatoes to start a potato spreading wildly throughout an area. The reason is that they can cope fairly well with most conditions as long as they have at least some drainage. Further, like other invasive species, potatoes can propagate fairly well once introduced. This is true of species like, say, willow. A willow needs a somewhat moist environment to grow but can tolerate periods of dry. It's also very easily able to propagate as a fallen branch, a root sucker, or just by touching the ground or a body of water. This means one tree can spread and become many trees very quickly and very easily. The result of this growth is that an invasive species will often displace native species from the ecosystem. This is a problem in and of itself as you move the natural biodiversity. And not just move it, but in some cases outright remove it. The other effect is that there are consequences that carry through to other species. For example, birds that rely on one particular species of tree for habitat, they may no longer have that particular tree or species present. In other cases, you have a change in the type of cover or foliage provided to the native species in the area. This may expose them to extra predation due to the lack of coverage, or in other cases, they may not have their food source. And of course, we have the problem of, invasive species using resources that previous species may not have done so. For example, long taproots in certain species of tree are very good for giving them a nice stable fixing in where they are and accessing deep untapped resources. But if that's not something other species in the area that natively live there do, suddenly they have a huge advantage and can very quickly outcompete. This is also particularly true in areas where, for example, you have low levels of surface water, or at least low-lying water which could otherwise be accessed more easily by trees. In other instances, certain trees or shrubs and other plants can cause certain metals and other minerals to build up in the soil, and this can become toxic to other plants. That's a more general threat, but there are cases where an invasive species may parasitize or otherwise kill off the local native species. For example, ivy. Ivy grows on just about any vertical surface it can find, including walls, trees, and more. This leads to trees being strangled by the ivy in its effort to grow taller and towards the sunlight. This is great if you want to have ivy growing everywhere, not so great if you want to be whatever it is that's being strangled to death by it. This means the ivy vine, like other invasive species, will grow fast and reproduce quickly, not only killing off the native species in the area, but then replacing it. Then we have the fact that certain invasive species can alter the environment and literally produce toxins. Now, a simple example is an animal in the form of cane toads. The cane toads will basically eat anything and everything that's small enough, let's say, to get into their mouth. But they're also poisonous enough that other species will not eat them, at least in Australia where they've been introduced. And because of this, they basically become a sort of apex predator because nothing will predate on them willingly. Now, in the terms of plants, well, it's a little bit different and more complicated, but you'll find that certain native species are more likely to be eaten, for example, by herbivores, or that there are certain chemical products that are made that make them undesirable. And of course, there are other things that will inhibit other plants from growing again. The worst case scenario, if you're really unlucky, is to have a tree species introduced that likes to catch on fire. Now, in parts of America, particularly Northeast America, you find that the fire season there is getting worse, and that's because they've introduced certain species of tree that have adapted very well to being burnt. And unfortunately, native species of tree don't do well when there's fire. Because of this, the native species die out because they simply can't survive, and the introduced invasive species do survive and become dominant. The spread of invasive species is perhaps a bigger issue, and it's one reason why we bring up this particular topic. Most of them are introduced via human activity. It's very rare to have, say, animals or similar phenomena that bring in a species to a completely new area that it's never been in before. And this is not to say it can't happen, just that it's exceptionally rare and, generally speaking, anything that does occur quickly dies off. It's human involvement that leads to invasive species not only going somewhere, but spreading very quickly, and as a result, becoming a somewhat dominant invasive species. This is why care of species that might be seen as invasive must be taken. They're not always dangerous or even a problem, but at the same time, you don't want to be caught unawares or by surprise when your own yard or plant collection starts having mishaps, because something you thought would be otherwise a nice and attractive addition becomes a invasive species and it causes you all sorts of grief. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.